War with Iran looking increasingly inevitable. Donald Trump banging the war drums. He's talked about a limited strike. That's just his statement that's just come out. But this, according to the brilliant guest I'm going to speak to, will still lead to war. There is no such thing as a limited encounter militarily in this particular context. I'm always allowed to speak to Trita Parsi, an Iranian-Swedish writer, analyst, former president of the National Iranian-American Council, co-founder of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Great to see you as ever.
Good to be with you again, Owen.
So Donald Trump's openly talking about what he says is a limited strike. The journalist who asked about this was removed from the press conference, I think. The event at the time. What is that? Could this just be then? I mean, he's got the biggest build-up since the 2003 Iraq War, biggest military build-up in the Middle East. But he's talking about a limited exchange. What do you make of that?
So what he is saying, and what has been reported by the Wall Street Journal, is that he's given the Iranians an offer, and he's tired of the Iranians not accepting it, so he's going to do a limited strike. And if they don't accept the offer after that strike, then he's going to escalate the strike until they either accept the offer or there is regime change in Iran. Now, that begs the question, what's the offer? Well, what was presented by the U.S. side in this last round in Geneva was essentially a capitulation offer. The Iranians would have to give up their entire nuclear program, and in return, they would not even get sanctions relief. They would get a pause, or essentially no more new sanctions. And there's hardly any more sanctions that can be imposed on Iran. But this is, of course, completely unacceptable to Iran because they are suffocating under the existing sanctions. So a deal that gives up all of the nuclear leverage they have in order to just retain the status quo, whereas the status quo is decaying their economy, is simply not something that is likely to be accepted by them. Moreover, they recognize that if they give up the nuclear leverage that they have, which is limited compared to what it was before, of course, it's not going to stop there. They think that that is just going to lead to the Israelis pushing for additional demands. And eventually, the US will come back and make additional demands on Iran's conventional forces and reach the missile file. And the missiles is the only deterrence that the Iranians currently have left. It's the only reason why the Israelis are not attacking again on their own. It's because of Iran's ability to strike back at Israel if they were to do so. So if you give that up, then essentially Israel has completely succeeded in subjugating Iran, and then he actually will be more likely to bomb Iran, the Iranians believe, if there is no deterrence against it. So the capitulation offer is fundamentally unattractive because it doesn't provide an exit out of the conflict. It actually makes the conflict worse from Tehran's perspective. And this is part of the reason why I think that their calculation will be instead, it's actually less risky for them to go to war, but it won't be a limited war. They will try to inflict as much damage on the US as possible, as quickly as possible, including closing down the Strait of Hormuz, attacking oil installations in the region, shoot up oil prices that shoots up inflation in the US. We already saw how the US economy is dramatically slowing down at this point. And the aim there is that their only chance of getting out of this situation is not that they could win a war militarily, but rather they just need to get as close as possible to destroying Trump's presidency before they lose the war. Meaning that if they inflict casualties on the US side, the global economy goes down, etc., that this will be enough of a pain for Trump that he will back off. Which is then providing the Iranians a better chance of Trump backing off than this capitulation offer that he's put on the table. I personally find both calculations, frankly, to be insane. First, I explain why I think is wrong on the American side. Let me also say why I think is wrong on the Iranian side. The Iranians are essentially basing this calculation on the belief or on the pattern that they saw with the Houthis. Trump attacked the Houthis, struck them really hard, but the Houthis actually fought back. And after 7 weeks, Trump kind of lost interest and he backed off, and he even actually praised the Houthis and said that they're a tough bunch of people. But the Houthis never managed to kill an American. They tried twice, on 2 occasions, American jets actually crashed, but the pilot survived. We've not been in a situation in which under Trump's presidency, 5, 10, 50, 100, 500 Americans are killed in battle. We do not know what Trump's psychology will be in that scenario. And for the Iranians to assume that it just means the Houthi scenario, but even greater, I think is a dangerous assumption. So we're having this misperception on both sides, dangerous calculations on both sides, leading us towards a disastrous war that likely will end up being a complete lose situation for both sides.
I mean, this is, as I've said, the biggest US military buildup in the Middle East since the Iraq War 2003. It includes several aircraft carriers, F-16, F-22, F-35 jets, and crucially, 2/3 of the US's E-3 command and control aircraft have been deployed to Europe and the Middle East. One military analyst says there's no PR value in deploying those critical aircraft. You wouldn't do so unless it was absolutely necessary. On that basis, is your view, just that alone, that this is inevitable, that, this is the whole deal, the so-called negotiations, which I know you've called out, are just kind of, they turn up the Iranian delegation, the US tell them to capitulate, that's the negotiation. Is that just a dead cert that this is potentially within days?
I mean, obviously, it's looking terrible and increasingly likely. I would not say that it is inevitable, though. And I say that partly because Trump is extremely unpredictable. I mean, remember, at one point in 2018, I believe he had ordered the bombing of Iran because the Iranians shut down an American drone. The jets had already left the aircraft carrier, and then he called them back. So nothing, I think, with him in particular is inevitable. So there's still a chance to stop this madness. And in fact, part of the reason why it still can be stopped is information flow to the president, based on folks I'm talking to here in Washington, seems to be limited. He has really been left under the impression by the Israelis and others, but mainly the Israelis, that the Iranians are just so weak, all you need to do is threaten them enough, bomb a little bit, and they're going to cave or collapse. And I don't think that is the case. The Iranians certainly are weaker than they were before, but they're not as weak as he thinks they are. So there is still an opportunity to be able to correct some things. In fact, the greatest opportunity is one that the Iranians have had, but they have refused to employ, which is that they should actually directly talk to Trump himself. Trump is having Netanyahu in his ears all the time. But it is the Iranians' fault that they're also not in his ears, and that all of that space is essentially held up by Netanyahu or by his allies. I do believe that a direct conversation between Trump and the Iranians would be the most effective de-escalatory mechanism. Now, whether it would automatically resolve the issue, obviously, is a different story, or even if it could lead to resolution, it's a different story. But it is one of the most important cards that have not been played.
The Wall Street Journal says, in terms of what the US may do, the options include a campaign to kill scores of Iranian political and military leaders with the goal of overthrowing the government, US and foreign officials said, as well as an airstrike that would be limited to striking targets, including nuclear and ballistic missile facilities. Both would involve a potentially weeks-long operation. I'm interested in your thoughts on that as a strategy, which is basically regime change via just blowing up and killing basically as much of the Iranian regime as you can. It's difficult to work out a precedent for that because the Iraq War, there was a land invasion. Obviously, it was a disaster. Libya, you had an armed uprising and then NATO intervention, which extended beyond the mandate granted to it by the United Nations Security Council, which wasn't regime change. Libya is obviously a failed state with two different governments. It's been obviously a disaster, a catastrophe. But I mean, Libya has a population of 6 million. I mean, Iraq at the time of the invasion had a population of 23 million. This is a population of over 90 million people, hugely ethnically diverse, a very rich tapestry, lots of internal political divisions, which we don't properly know about in terms of the full extent. I'm just trying to work out what that strategy actually means in practice and what precedent it's kind of drawing on.
Well, I think, first of all, we don't have any precedent of an air campaign bringing about regime change. Even in the Venezuelan case, first of all, there were US troops on the ground, not on a large amount, but also it wasn't a regime change, it was a change within the regime. And much indicates that what the US is looking for here is exactly that, a change within the regime. I think there have been some attempts to look at whether they could find elements within the current system that would be willing to work with them in the manner that apparently some people in the Venezuelan system was willing to work with them to overthrow Maduro. And they have failed at doing so. But the thinking then is, well, if any of these different political leaders, particularly the supreme leader, is killed, a new scenario will emerge. What will that scenario look like? And would those new leaders, if they manage to take over and we don't have a complete collapse of the state, what position would they take in terms of direct negotiations with the US and accepting this capitulation offer, essentially? So I think, again, based on a lot of very, very flimsy assumptions, and the whole thing from the outset is very flimsy. We're talking about absolutely no American interest that is being served by this. We have no debate in the country about this. We have no vote in Congress about this. We have no support in the American public. We're talking about 18% of the public supporting this. 35% of Republicans support it, but 53% of Republicans actually oppose it. And that's Republicans. The numbers amongst Democrats and independents are far, far larger. In total, 18%. Just as a point of comparison, when George W. Bush invaded Iraq, he had 79% support. And it still ended up becoming not only a disaster, but the public dramatically turned against it as it became clear it was based on lies and it was only destabilizing the region and creating disaster. So all of these different things, and we don't have the other thing that is obviously crucial. How does this end? We don't have the answer to that. We haven't even properly asked that question. So the fact that Trump is even going in this direction is, I think, shocking. I mean, again, think about it. He said that he had obliterated the program in June of last year, the nuclear program. Now, December 29th, Netanyahu comes back to Washington, has a meeting with him, and then suddenly this whole thing starts again. And Trump is now suddenly talking about, that he needs to get rid of the missile program, et cetera, et cetera. We're seeing this constant adjusting to and adapting of the Israeli position on this matter. And that's the key reason as why we are in this current situation.
In terms of, there's such an important point you made about public opinion there, which is, starting from a position, much infinitely weaker position than Iraq, Afghanistan, that was 90% plus. Look how that turned out. But also the MAGA base divided. He promised an end to the endless wars and all the rest of it. In terms of what Iran could militarily do, I'll ask about the economic issue question after that. Because we haven't seen that. We saw it actually inflicted quite a lot of damage on Israel that, wasn't properly, I think, articulated or discussed at the time. But I suppose this would be different because it would be considered an existential threat to the regime. So they would think they would end up thinking we don't have much to lose, perhaps. So what do you think that could mean militarily in terms of how things could escalate as a consequence of the US launching, as you know, an illegal war, by the way?
Yeah. Again, the one thing I forgot to mention is that obviously all of this is completely incompatible with international law. Even the threats are incompatible with international law. Well, first of all, when it comes to the question of what the Iranians could do, let's just take a step back and see why they're thinking that they would even consider something as insane as a direct war with the superpower of the world. They have adopted a strategy earlier on in which they called it strategic patience. They took a lot of hits from the Israelis in Syria and other places and essentially absorbed those and calculated that time was on its side. And as a result, it was better for the Israelis to have a confrontation early rather than to have it 10 years from now. But that also led to a scenario in which the Israelis increasingly became emboldened in how they were attacking the Iranians, recognizing that the Iranians would not strike back. And even when the Iranians did strike back, it was aimed at avoiding escalation. When the Israelis struck their embassy in Damascus, the Iranians struck back with 9 or so missiles, just to show their capability, but it was designed to make sure that they didn't kill anyone. They struck back a little bit harder in October of 2024, but still very limited, just showing their capability rather than escalating in turn. By June, the strategy changed because then it was an all-out war by the Israelis and these Iranians started to strike back hard, but it was still done in a way in which they thought it was going to be a long war. So they were pacing their attacks and their retaliations. Now I think they reached a conclusion that every time they agree either to a ceasefire or they agree to de-escalate, all it has done is to gradually weaken their position so that it makes it easier and easier for Israel or the United States to attack them again. So for instance, if they were to give up their missiles, it would be a dramatic shift in which it would be even easier for them to get bombed. So this has then led to a scenario in which they believe that they have to strike back disproportionately right away to make sure that they essentially turn the tables on this equation. Now, what can they do? I'm not a military expert to be able to give you any detailed explanation of what their missiles can and cannot do, but I'll just point to this. Almost all of the ships that the US has brought into the region are actually staying quite a bit away from the Persian Gulf, staying away from the distance that Iranian missiles can travel. And I think that is, and they're moving a lot of other type of military assets to the region in order to attack from the air and do a lot of refueling in the air, because they have to have the aircraft carriers so far away from Iran that even the fighter just cannot make the distance back and forth without getting refueled. That in and of itself tells you that at a minimum, the Pentagon is sufficiently concerned about Iran's missiles capabilities and their ability to be able to take down American ships if they're within the distance, that they have decided to do all of this from a very, very far distance. Now, that then leaves the Iranians with perhaps options that are even worse. I mean, they might be attacked. I mean, obviously, they would likely attack American bases in the region, but most of them have already been emptied, as they were back in June. So they would be attacking empty bases, very few people there, and very few equipment there. But they may then go after civilian oil infrastructure in the region, as well as closing the Strait of Hormuz, in order to shoot up oil prices and shoot up inflation in the United States and put pressure that way. It could also be a scenario in which they would go after softer targets. If there are no bases, if there are no military equipment that they can strike that is striking them, they may shoot back at, for instance, US embassies in the region, Baghdad, for instance. But this, again, is a scenario I think they have done everything they can to avoid. But I think they're now having their backs against the wall and thinking anything but some sort of a disproportionate response will likely invite even further attacks. It's just going to be more gradual. It's going to be mowing the lawn, but in slow motion.
What if, because I was going to ask you about the economic, you mentioned there, obviously the Strait of Hormuz, so that covered that. What if, for example, they killed the supreme leader, Khamenei? What would happen then? Because that is definitely on the cards. I mean, they clearly considered the Israelis were going to do that themselves. I mean, what kind of consequences could that have, for example?
So the Israelis tried, actually, but they couldn't locate the supreme leader. But it wasn't as if they were withholding against him. So by now, most likely, they have already made a decision of who replaces the supreme leader, and probably made a decision who replaces that replacement of the supreme leader, recognizing. They've even said that they have put in the 5 next people in line for almost every key position, recognizing that this is going to be a very key element of either an American or an Israeli strategy against Iran. The one thing I think the Trump administration is willing to accept, a risk that they're willing to accept in this scenario, which perhaps they may not have thought through carefully, is that at the end of the day, the supreme leader of Iran is not just de facto head of state. He's also a Shia figure in the Shia world, which means that this will have repercussions likely in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Pakistan, in Bahrain, in other countries with large Shia populations in which he has a religious following. This will put a tremendous amount of pressure on Ayatollah Sistani, who otherwise has tried to stay out of these things and has really tried to stay out of doing anything that is defending Iran, for instance. But this will put a lot of pressure on him, because this is essentially an assassination of a fellow Marja-e Taqlid, an Ayatollah that is not at the level of Sistani, but nevertheless has that title of source of emulation. So there's an element there that is very difficult to predict exactly how it will go, but it probably carries some significant risk. But I think the reason why the administration may be attracted to do this nevertheless is because they have identified, and probably quite correctly, that a key reason as to why the Iranians are not agreeing to talk directly to Trump or to agree to some other form of engagement or a deal is the supreme leader. And you take out the supreme leader, you take out several other key officials. They want to see whatever comes next. Are they willing to make a deal similar to what the regime in Venezuela did, in which, in order to save the regime itself, they would agree to some form of a major subjugation. And in the case of Venezuela, it's very clear that it's subjugation. I mean, Trump is saying that he's running the country. One of the first things that the Venezuelans had to do was to start selling oil to Israel. Mm-hmm. So the real directions that the country would have to go in that type of a scenario, I think, is quite clear. The question is, would any element of the regime be willing to accept that for their own survival? And would they be able to survive that, incidentally? Because they're having a base, and that base is probably going to be very unforgiving of such capitulation. But again, I think the administration is looking at these things because at the end of the day, what seems to be very clear is that Trump doesn't want to have ground troops. He doesn't want to have chaos. He wants to do enough damage to get someone else in control so that they're willing to capitulate on Trump's terms.
And do you think that, I mean, the Venezuela option is plausible, where you get rid of the leader and then you just get someone with a gun to their head to do your bidding?
I don't find it plausible. I think the administration has concluded that as long as Khamenei is alive, it's not possible at all. And the question is, if he is dead, is it plausible then? And that is part of the reason I think they are considering an assassination of that kind.
I mean, in terms of the dynamics within Iran, because I mean, if we think about Iraq, for example, I mean, Saddam Hussein's regime basically had negligible support, I would say, by the time of 2003. I mean, I was in Baghdad a few months ago, and now people have become nostalgic about that a regime they would have actually abhorred when it collapsed because of the horrific disorder that erupted. You know, people said to me, you know, they would say to me, "You destroyed this country," when they found out I was British. But this is different, isn't it? Because there is widespread opposition to the regime in Iran, no question, not least after the hideous crackdown against Iranian protesters. But I mean, if we look at the elections, you have, I know that I mean, there were conservative people who vote for the most conservative candidate of the ones presented before them is millions of people. So, I mean, we don't know what support base the regime actually has, but it does actually have a diehard section of the population, doesn't it? In a way that Colonel Gaddafi didn't in Libya, and Saddam Hussein didn't have in 2003.
Absolutely. Let me just give you a small anecdote, or actually two of them. I was at the Munich conference just a week or so ago. On my way to the airport, my driver was an Iraqi Kurd who started talking to me. And I have to say, I was quite stunned to see how nostalgic. I mean, he was very explicitly nostalgic about Saddam Hussein, and he is Kurdish. I mean, Saddam was more brutal against the Kurds than against any other ethnic group, including using chemical warfare against them. So that type of nostalgia, I think, is an indication that even if the country slowly but surely is picking itself up, it is nevertheless set back 50, 70 years if you have a war of this kind, a killing of the kind that happened in Iraq, and the terrible, terrible ordeal that they have to deal with, not just during the war, but also after the war. And I think right now, there's a lot of Iranians, not a majority, but a lot of Iranians that are rightfully extremely angered by the brutality of the Iranian theocracy and killing all of these people in January. But as a result, are thinking that even war would be better than this. And I think that is not only mistaken, but it's also based on actually not knowing what these countries actually went through in the last 20 years. The other thing, I think, another example you can give in addition to Gaddafi and Saddam is actually the Shah himself. By the time the revolution happened, his own support base had grown extremely small, including inside of his own regime. Ministers, people within the ministries themselves who believed that a revolution was necessary. Personally, again, I think they were all mistaken because they were just thinking anything is better. We just need to get rid of the Shah. And I think they ended up in a worse situation than the dictatorship of the Shah after the revolution. But you're absolutely right. We are talking about a system that probably still has about 10 to 15% support of the population. Numbers vary. No one has the exact data. Some people would say that it goes above 25 or so, but let's say that it is 10 to 15%. We're talking in that scenario about 15 million people that are diehard supporters of this theocracy. That makes it a very different situation from what you had in Iraq. and Libya. And even in those situations, you still ended up in a civil war. You still ended up in a civil war in Syria. So many of these Iranians that are now pushing very hard for military intervention, etc., seem to believe, or actually explicitly say, that Iran would never have civil war. It's just different from these other countries. But reality is, the Syrians also thought that they're very different from the Iraqis and thought that there wouldn't be a civil war. And look what happened there: 15 years of absolutely horrible civil war.
I mean, obviously, this attack would. The argument would be behind this attack that they're pushing internally is that they'll get an uprising, an armed uprising, and you basically then get a pincer effect. I mean, what do you think about the prospects of that, and also the role of, given you were mentioning the Shah, of Reza Pahlavi, who's obviously the crown prince from that regime, the
former crown prince.
Sorry, good point. The former crown prince of the son of the deposed Shah. What do you think? What do you think his role? And actually, because it's interesting with him, because actually Trump seems not actually sold on him at all. And actually, although you did get support from some on the streets, for example, during that the mass protests, he made a series of calls for people to take drastic action, which no one followed that call, did they? So I'm just interested in what you think about the question of an uprising if this happens, but also his role.
Yeah. So I think undoubtedly Pahlavi, the son of the former Shah, has gained a degree of support that he absolutely did not have before. Some of it, I think, has been orchestrated, manufactured through social media, etc. But that has translated into real support. And we've seen that very clearly with very large numbers showing up, for instance, in Munich to protest on his behalf. Inside the country, I think the picture is different. Without a doubt, there was also a growing number of supporters of his inside the country. His name was heard at a lot of these different protests on January 8th and 9th in particular, and also a little bit prior to that. The depth of that support, however, I think is an open question, because we did not see the population responding to his future subsequent calls. He called for all strikes, he called for other type of protests. None of that was responded to. I reviewed a lot of videos over what happened on February 11th. That was the anniversary of the revolution. And a lot of people protested at night over voicing, the calls, the celebrations by screaming "death to the dictator." I reviewed a lot of those videos. I couldn't find any videos in which people were calling for the son of the Shah. They had actually gone back to the previous slogan, which was just "death to the dictator," rather than shouting his name. Now, I obviously didn't watch every video that was out there, but I did talk to a lot of people in Iran just to get a sense, was that heard or not? And people hadn't thought of it, the ones that I spoke to, but when they thought about it, they actually didn't notice that either. They weren't taken that much by surprise, because they always felt that the support for the Shah was more or less superficial, and it was driven by desperation and anger and an effort to try to just give the most insulting slogan against the current theocracy that they possibly could. But also probably because of the fact that he did promise support, he did all of these things, thousands of people were killed, and he had nothing to be able to deliver to support them for. Clearly, Western leaders are not listening to him to the manner that he wants them to. Now, would he have a chance inside the system? I don't believe so. I don't believe that he would, because, again, you have to be able to get the security establishment to defect to your side. And what he has done so far has not even been designed to get the security establishment to come to his side. Rather, it has been designed to get Donald Trump to view him as someone that is compatible with Trump's vision, that someone that will be a good pliant supporter of Trump, in order to get Trump's support to install him from above, rather than him being able to actually get to power from below by having popular support and having the ability to get the security establishment to defect to his side.
I mean, in terms of the potential for the country to collapse into some degree of violent chaos, and the role of Israel in that, because Israel is, as you said right at the beginning, the most aggressively pushing this. I mean, they think they have most to stand to gain, obviously. And they think, I think rationally, in their heads, that the best case scenario would be for Iran to just descend into permanent chaos. That would suit them very well indeed. I mean, do you think that is plausible given the dynamics within the country? The just the how diverse Iranian society is, the divisions within Iranian society. I mean, what do you think about those prospects? And also, what we saw, I thought it was interesting during the protests, and obviously a hideous crackdown by the regime, is like there were some attacks on mosques, which some have just obviously concluded, they're angry at being force-fed religion against their will all the time, and then they saw mosques as a symbol of the regime. But millions of Iranians obviously are observant Muslims, but you can see how that anger could end up fueling very problematic, disturbing internal divisions where people have radicalized to such a degree against kind of, they've taken their fury at the regime into a particular avenue.
First, we have to remind ourselves, you don't need to have ethnic diversity or religious diversity in order to have the ingredients for a civil war. If you have those things, yes, it could lead to the civil war getting longer. It could lead to the civil war getting more difficult to resolve because it takes on additional identity variables that are just very difficult to reconcile. But, you had a massive civil war in the United States, you had a massive civil war in Greece, in Spain, without many of those different type of variables present. So I do fear that, the key thing is that absolute divisions within society, and I think it's very clear. You have those divisions, you have even clearer divisions in the Iranian diaspora at this point. I do very much fear not only the civil war, but I fear that there is an arrogant discounting of the risk of civil war, which in and of itself actually makes the civil war more risky and more likely because people are not taking it seriously. In addition to that, remember, most civil wars do not last for more than a year because of simply lack of resources for all sides to be able to shoot at each other with and a fatigue. When they tend to go beyond that is because there actually is outside support for various factions. This is what we've seen in the Middle East, whether it is Yemen, whether it is Iraq, whether it is Syria, in which almost all countries, in Iran itself certainly, has been a very active party using those civil wars to fight its geopolitical rivals in the region. And by that, prolonging that war, just as the United States has, just as the UK has, just as Saudi Arabia, Turkey, UAE has. Now, in the case of Iran, there's clear incentives for several states, particularly Israel, to fuel a civil war. And it's not just because a civil war would consume Iran's power internally and more or less for 5 decades take Iran off the geopolitical chessboard and make sure that it is not having the capacity of posing a threat to Israel's designs for domination. But also, that civil war will be very, very problematic for Iraq, for Pakistan, for Turkey, with the Kurdish question. And Turkey in particular is the next coming rival to Israel based on what the Israelis themselves are saying. So they're killing 2 birds with a stone there, not only getting rid of Iran as a potential rival, but also simultaneously weakening Turkey in a manner that would be very useful for the Israelis, again, for their objective of having that type of a military domination that they're seeking in the region.
And that was just actually a final question, just reminded me of Iraq. I mean, partly, by the way, you could see it's what people don't talk about enough, but the obviously the Iraqi government, the Iraqi politics are so intertwined with Iran, and I can see the imprint there everywhere in Baghdad, by the way. But also, what was really there was a brilliant author who I went with to Baghdad, Gaith Abdul Ahad, who wrote brilliant book about Iraq, and what he emphasized in that is exiled politicians who lacked roots within the country had to make, in the case of Iraq, sectarian appeals to kind of gain legitimacy, which is then fueled the sectarian hideous bloodbath that enveloped Iraq. The point I'm making is when you get exiled, there's a lot of obviously exiled Iranians who we hear from, many, and it's just, we saw what happened with Iraq in that context. I'm just wondering if you think there's any potential dangers and parallels.
Oh, the parallels are absolutely clear. I remember in 2003 on American TV, exiled Iraqis who favored bombing their own country were paraded through the TV stations nonstop. in order to make the case to the American people, not just that Saddam Hussein was a threat, but to really make the case that this was the morally right thing to do. And that is what we're really seeing folks are now zeroing in on and saying that this regime is not just a threat to the United States, but it is a threat to the Iranian people. This would be an act of mercy. Bombing that country, killing thousands of people would be an act of mercy. It would be the morally right thing to do, the obvious choice if the president of the United States was Mother Teresa. That's the argument that is essentially being made. And so the repeat of what we saw in Iraq is not only shocking in that sense, but also shocking to see how easily mainstream figures who have spent the last 20 years complaining about Iraq and complaining how the media fell for it and the role that the media played are back doing exactly the same thing. And it's happening on the left and it's happening on the right, or on the Republican and the Democratic side. Once again. And also the fact that you're seeing that this is having resonance with certain segments of the American public. I want to really emphasize this. Segments. And that specific segment is the demographic above 55 years old. They're the ones who are still falling for these type of arguments, believing that, you know, military intervention is some sort of a knight on a white horse, whatever the expression is, that comes and saves people. When you go down in the age groups, you see that there's absolutely no belief in that whatsoever. And that's part of the reason that despite of this, all of this parading and all of these exiled leaders coming out there begging for their country to be bombed, only 18% of the American public actually support this.
Really, really striking stuff there. And, you know, history doesn't, as the cliche go, often repeat itself, but often rhymes. But it isn't in lots of senses, because the conditions are much, much worse, both from the level of support, the nature of the military action, and the fact that of all the presidents to avoid the catastrophes of the past, it would have to be Donald Trump. Seems rather unlikely. Please like and subscribe. Your thoughts and your comments. Do share the video. But Trita, honestly, always a pleasure. Just for people watching, do always check out his articles. Follow him on social media. He's always incredibly insightful. So please do that. But thanks, Emma.
Thank you so much, Ron.